Hey everybody, good evening. Welcome to Sweet Jesus, because ice cream is sweet, but Jesus is sweeter. Welcome, brothers and sisters in Christ, seekers, friends of friends, Holy Cross friends. Um, Glad you could be with me tonight. Got a little bit of a cold I've been kind of fighting off the last few days, so um, probably going to try and keep it short tonight, which works because it's just the very end of chapter 8. There's a spot where I stop because it's kind of enough probably to talk about just on its own. But finishing up chapter 8, here we are. Hope you've got yourself a bowl of ice cream. It's, of course, my favorite dessert. Or maybe you've got an apple crisp. Maybe you've got blueberry pie. Maybe you got some vanilla ice cream to go with that, or to go with a brownie, or milk and cookies, something like that. Your favorite evening sweet treat. Hope you get a chance to enjoy that while we go through this last little bit of chapter 8 in The Reason for God by Tim Keller. I have ice cream from a place called Just Ice Cream and a bit more. But Just Ice Cream, it's in Brewster, Ohio. Fantastic find. And I've got a little bit left here of Turtle Mud. That's right. So it's kind of a cross between Mississippi mud and like a turtle sundae. Chocolate ice cream, caramel sort of swirled in there with pecans and chocolate covered caramel pieces. It's delicious. So join me. It's good stuff. Just Ice Cream, the shop is actually closing for the season this weekend. So take the opportunity. Encourage you to get out there. It is rivaling my favorite ice cream place. It might just be number one or tied for one or maybe number two, something like that. They have so many great flavors and stuff. But anyway, I know you're not usually tuning in here just for the ice cream, but it is fun. Anyway, the Clue Killer. This is a really tricky topic. I think it will hopefully make sense. I think Tim Keller does a really good job of trying to help us understand it. But it might be something that maybe you've never thought of. And so that's partly why I want to spend some time just on this. It's something that your average person, your average Christian has probably not really considered, but it has been a very persuasive argument against belief in God for many people. It's something that, if you get into any kind of debate with a fairly educated, well-read, well-prepared, intelligent skeptic, atheist person of some kind, this is usually what they eventually get to. And I think it's something that, because most Christians haven't really been educated on, we don't really talk about it. We just think belief in God is so obvious in so many ways that I may not even get this far into a conversation with a skeptic, but this is something that's out there. It's something that gets used fairly frequently. Just as an example, one of the issues that, one of the things, like, I see sometimes Christians posting things on Facebook and other places in conversations is that, well, how do you explain right and wrong and morality and all of that kind of stuff, like without a God? And a lot of Christians just leave it at that and kind of look down on people, but actually they have an answer for that, and this is part of the answer. The answer is that, well, we humans eventually develop morality through this evolutionary process, and it's what helps the most people survive. It's what helps us survive and our families survive and all those things. And that's how there is morality and there is right and wrong. And we, just because you're an atheist, just because you believe in evolution, doesn't mean you don't have morals. That's kind of what they're actually almost defending themselves from criticism from Christians that think that, well, I believe in evolution and I don't believe in God, therefore I'm an evil person. And I think that's something important for us to think about, because actually there are a lot of good people that are atheists or believe in evolution, all those kinds of things. I do think there are societal implications for changing our approach to morality in certain ways and things like that. But I don't think that people that don't believe in God are somehow evil just because of that, or that they can't be good because of that. Christians, I think we got to be more careful about how we talk. I know I've tried to be better about that. And as we've read, actually, in this book, earlier in this book, sometimes the people that aren't Christian are better people than the Christian people. Because Christianity appeals to people that know they're really bad. And just because they become a Christian doesn't mean they become really good overnight. And so that's part of why, people have this confused, difficult to understand picture of Christianity, because they encounter people who aren't as far along in their maturity in faith. But they do still have morality. They do still have a basis for it. And that's kind of what we're talking about here right now. I'm picking it up on page 140. I hope you have a copy of the book too. If you don't, I encourage you to get one. You can probably borrow it at your public library. Get it on Kindle for sure, and get through Amazon pretty quickly. It's a really good book. It's a really good resource. And it's so important to have the book precisely because these topics are so deep. There's so much to them. And if you really, as a Christian, want to be prepared to defend your faith, you gotta have this resource handy so that you have that conversation with somebody. And then you go, you know what? I don't know the answer to that. I don't have a response to that, but I know where I can get some more information. So I'm going to get back to you. You want to have this on your shelf so you can go home and take a look at it. It's a very good reference to have available. And if you're a skeptic, a seeker, or whatever, and I would encourage you to get the book too, to examine it closely. And hey, everybody, there's all these notes. There's like 30 or 40 pages just of notes with all kinds of additional resources that you can check out if you are serious about, strengthening your faith as a Christian, or pursuing faith and pursuing your doubts as a non-believer, a non-theist person. So anyway, here we go. Page 140, The Clue Killer. So in our culture, there's a very influential school of thought that claims to have the answers to all of these so-called clues. Those are the clues that we talked about last week. A variety of clues. Heard from some of you about your favorite clue. If you haven't reached out to me and tell me your favorite clue, the clue that seems most compelling to you, let me know. Pastor.Grederson, Pastor. Grederson, Gretarson @gmail.com. So there's a school of thought that answers all of those clues. This is the school of evolutionary biology that claims everything about us can be explained as a function of natural selection. Then he references a book by Daniel Dennett that claims to, tries to explain this. He says, if we have religious feelings, it is only because those traits once helped certain people survive their environment in greater numbers and therefore pass that genetic code on to us. And then he quotes the book here. Everything we value, from sugar and sex and money to music and love and religion, we value for reasons. Lying behind and distinct from our reasons are evolutionary reasons, free-floating rationales that have been endorsed by natural selection. So the idea is that everything that we value because at some point it helped our ancestors survive. And that includes even a belief in God. And he talks about a New York Times Magazine article. We know that the idea of an infallible God is comfortable and familiar, something children readily accept. Why? Some evolutionists, such as David Sloan Wilson, think belief in God made people happier and more unselfish, which meant their families and tribes survived and they got better mates. Others, such as Scott Atran and Richard Dawkins, posit that belief in God is an accidental byproduct of other traits that did give adaptive advantage. So there's actually a few different schools of thought as to how this manifested itself or how it came to be. Our ancestors who survived were most prone to detect agents in the brush, even when they weren't there. This is kind of condescending. I mean, it's assuming things about Christians, that we're spooked by mysterious things that don't actually exist. We're just anyway. Let me finish the page here, the paragraph. Our ancestors who survived were most prone to detect agents in the brush, even when they weren't there, and were most likely to impose narratives, causal reasoning on everything that happened around them. However, these same traits make us more likely to believe in God, to see agents and narratives and intelligences where they don't actually exist. So the idea is you are more likely to survive in a very chaotic, unpredictable, dangerous environment if you're paranoid. And being paranoid and giving explanation to the reasons for your paranoia and the things you think you're seeing or the things you think you're hearing, that's the same kind of behavior that would lead someone to believe in God. And so therefore, that trait, that adaptation, that aspect of natural selection was passed down, and it became a way for people to ultimately also believe in a God. So again, seems pretty condescending and certainly doesn't put Christians, us Christians, in a very good light. But that's their reasoning. Now, despite some debates, so not everybody in the field of evolutionary biology, evolutionary theorists, they don't all agree about this, as we've already talked about here briefly. They all agree that our capacity to believe in God is hardwired into our physiology because it was directly or indirectly associated with traits that helped our ancestors adapt to their environment. That's why arguments for God appeal to so many of us. That's all there is to it. The clues are clues to nothing. So that's their explanation to all the stuff that we talked about last week, all these clues of God, these things that can't prove God, but that lead us to go, maybe. Seems compelling. And then you add them all up, it seems very compelling. And they're just saying, well, all of that is based off of our imagination that's hardwired into us by evolution through natural selection. However, there are many who believe not only that the clue killer argument has a fatal contradiction in it, but that it actually points to another clue for God. Now, this is something I probably haven't talked about enough throughout this whole process. And that is that despite popular understandings of Christianity, one of the things that Keller tries to get across is that Christians actually become more faithful, better Christians by thinking, by using their brains, by using their reason. And actually, the more you reason with some of the arguments against Christianity, against the belief in God, the more those ideas and reasons against God start to fall apart. And this is going to be another one of those cases. In the last part of Dawkins' book, The God Delusion, he admits that since we are the product of natural selection, we can't completely trust our own senses. After all, evolution is interested only in preserving adaptive behavior, not true belief. So in the end, this clue killer argument is essentially saying that nothing that we recognize about the universe, all of our evolutionary hardwired reasoning, is irrelevant because our minds are wired to believe things that are going to help us survive. They're not wired to help us believe things that are true, or not that they're not true, but that there's no reason for us to believe that they are true just because we believe them to be true. Uh, our brains are so, this is the argument, right, that they're making, and sort of the evolutionary folks and the atheists. Evolution is so hardwired us that we can't trust anything, because the only thing we can trust about what we think and what we believe is that it's going to help us stay alive, and that it's going to help us protect our families and keep our genetic code moving on. Another scientist says, in some circumstances, a symbolic belief that departs from factual reality fares better. In other words, paranoid false beliefs are often more effective at helping you survive than accurate ones, right? So maybe believing a lie is better for our genetic code, and so therefore we believe lies. And that's essentially the argument they're making about God and Christianity and all that kind of stuff. But again, here Keller is saying they don't understand the full implications of this crucial insight. Evolution, bottom of page 141, evolution can only be trusted to give us cognitive faculties that help us live on, not to provide ones that give us an accurate and true picture of the world around us. And then he quotes Patricia Churchland, just kind of getting at that same point. She heard this end of her quote: "Truth, whatever that is, takes the hindmost," meaning it doesn't matter. In this idea of natural selection and evolutionary code and what helps us survive, truth is completely irrelevant. Which is interesting because they're using a lot of these arguments supposedly to argue for truth, that there is no God. We're going to get more out of that here. He quotes again, he's looking at this guy, Thomas Nagel, prominent philosopher and atheist. He actually agrees in the last chapter of his book, The Last Word, right? So here's a guy who is an atheist and critical of religion, but is very honest about it. He's honest about his own desire that, he doesn't want to believe in God. He's honest about that. We talked about that last week. He writes that, to be sure my mind is telling me what is really truly out there in the world, I must, quote, follow the rules of logic because they are correct, not merely because I am biologically programmed to do so. However, according to evolutionary biology, laws of reason would have to make sense to us only because they help us survive, not because they necessarily tell us truth. So this guy Nagel asks the question, can we have any continued confidence in reason as a source of knowledge about the non-apparent character of the world? In itself, I believe an evolutionary story of the human race tells against such confidence. Here's a guy who's an atheist himself, And he's actually saying that the theories of evolution, natural selection, and the ways a lot of philosophers and scientists are talking about that today, they don't really they don't really hold up. Ultimately, there are too many holes in this to support it. Evolutionists say that if God makes sense to us, it's not because he's really there, it's only because that belief helped us survive. However, if we can't trust our belief forming faculties to tell us the truth about God, why should we trust them to tell us the truth about anything, including evolutionary science? If our cognitive faculties only tell us what we need to survive, not what is true, why trust them about anything at all? So, the clue killer argument actually has a fatal flaw within itself. Seems that evolutionary theorists have to do one of two things. They could backtrack and admit that we can trust what our minds tell us about things, including God. If we find arguments or clues to God's existence that seem compelling to us, well, maybe he's really there. Or else they could go forward and admit that we can't trust our minds about anything. What is not fair is to do what so many evolutionary scientists are doing now. They are applying the scalpel of their skepticism to what our minds tell us about God, but not to what our minds are telling us about evolutionary science itself. So, an inherent hypocrisy, essentially. They will use this idea to take apart religion, to take apart the ideas of God and faith, but they won't use that argument in a consistent way against even their own thinking. Huge Achilles heel in the whole enterprise of evolutionary biology and theory. Charles Darwin himself saw this major vulnerability. To a friend, Darwin wrote that the horrid doubt always arises whether the convictions of man's mind, which has been developed from the mind of the lower animals, are of any value or at all trustworthy. From Darwin himself. Alvin Plantinga also continues this argument. He says that it is ultimately irrational to accept evolutionary naturalism, the theory that everything in us is caused only by natural selection. If it were true, we couldn't trust the methods by which we arrived at it or any scientific theory at all. And here he's quoting him. People like Dawkins hold that there is a conflict between science and religion. The truth of the matter, however, is that the conflict is between science and naturalism, not between science and belief in God. It's as likely, given unguided evolution, that we live in a sort of dream world as that we actually know something about ourselves and our world. And so science and religion are not in conflict. In fact, if you remember earlier, I think it was last week, in this same chapter, or possibly in the intermission section, it takes belief in God ultimately in history for science to explode. These are Christians that are willing to trust in the observable laws of the universe and put them to the test and use them to explore and to experiment. They are the ones ultimately that lead to an explosion in science and technology. But here we're seeing that if you are honest about this idea of naturalism, right? So not so much science, but this idea that everything is caused only by natural selection, this idea that the universe just kind of came into being by itself by these natural processes. That's the conflict. Those two things are actually in serious conflict. And if you're honest with yourself about your philosophy, why should you trust those laws? I think we talked about that, maybe not last week, the week before, or maybe it was last week, in this idea of how you determine things that are true, and how philosophers now are even just totally, well, why are we believing that if I drop something, it's going to continue to fall, that the laws of gravity are going to continue to remain in force. Why should I believe that? There's no reason for me to believe that philosophically. Anyway, bottom line, science and religion are not in conflict. Let's see. Despite all these new books by people like Richard Dawkins and Daniel Dennett and Sam Harris, more and more thinkers are seeing through these arguments, and not just Orthodox believers like me, Christians, but those like Thomas Nagel, Leon Wieseltier, I don't know, sorry, I butchered his name. Maybe you guys know how to say that one better. Bottom of 143. The literary editor of the New Republic points out the flaw in the clue killer argument in his review of Daniel Dennett's book, Breaking the Spell. It says, Dennett portrays reason in service to natural selection and as a product of natural selection. But if reason is a product of natural selection, then how much confidence can we have in a rational argument for natural selection? Right? It's circular reasoning. The power of reason is owed to the independence of reason and to nothing else. Evolutionary biology cannot invoke the power of reason even as it destroys it. Right? So again, hypocrisy, circular thinking, they're not being intellectually honest if they don't also destroy their own theories. Right? So either they're wrong about this or they're right and they have to be more critical of their own theories. Keller says it this way: if, as the evolutionary scientists say, what our brains tell us about morality, love, and beauty is not real, if it is merely a set of chemical reactions designed to pass on our genetic code, then so is what their brains tell them about the world. Then why should they trust them? All right. So, a lot on just one idea here. Hopefully it made sense to you. I tried to take a little bit more time on it. We do have the last section here is actually where Keller is suggesting now that this idea, the clue killer, is actually another clue. So it's another one of those clues of God, just like, what did we look at last time? The regularity of nature, the clue of beauty, the cosmic welcome mat, the mysterious bang. C.S. Lewis's idea of the playwright sort of having to write himself into the story, right? Like, you can't just explore within the story and expect to go upstairs and find Shakespeare. Just like we shouldn't go around and find, oh, look, there's God. Like, that's just, so all of those clues, he's saying this is actually a clue. The clue killer argument, the argument they make that says that all these clues are useless because of this evolutionary idea. Natural selection has hardwired us to believe this. He's saying that it's not just it's not just bad reasoning, that it actually provides another clue itself to God. Where does he say this? Our religious, aesthetic, and moral intuitions are there only because they helped our ancestors survive, right? That's what someone would say, perhaps a secular person. However, as many thinkers point out, if this argument proves anything at all, it proves too much. If we can't trust our belief-forming faculties in one area, we should not trust them in any area. If there is no God, we should not trust our cognitive faculties at all. Oh, but we do. And that's the final clue, right? So if we believe God exists, then our view of the universe gives us a basis for believing that cognitive faculties work, since God could make us able to form true beliefs and knowledge. If we believe in God, then the Big Bang is not mysterious, nor the fine-tuning of the universe, nor the regularities of nature. All the things that we see make perfect sense. Also, if God exists, our intuitions about the meaningfulness of beauty and love are to be expected. If you don't believe in God, not only are all these things profoundly inexplicable, but your view that there is no God would lead you not to expect them. Though you have little reason to believe your rational faculties work, you continue to go on using them, right? So the fact, let me just finish. We'll finish what he's got here. You have no basis for believing that nature will go on regularly, but you continue to use inductive reasoning and language. You have no good reason to trust your senses that love and beauty matter, but you keep on doing it. We're all doing this every single day. We know, right? So these evolutionary ideas lead us to believe that there's no reason for us to trust our mind at all, and yet we do each and every day. So it kind of leads us back to, because intuitively we know that it does work, that we are thinking, there is reason, there is logic. And so again, here is something that ultimately leads us to another clue of God. He rounds it out here. Of course, none of the clues we've been looking for actually proves God. Every one of them is rationally avoidable. However, their cumulative effect is, I think, provocative and potent. Though the secular view of the world is rationally possible, it doesn't make as much sense of all these things as the view that God exists. That's why we call them clues. The theory that there is a God who made the world accounts for the evidence we see far better than the theory that there is no God. Those who argue against the existence of God go right on using induction, language, and their cognitive faculties, all of which make far more sense in a universe in which a God has created and supports them all by his power. Now, of course, if you don't want to believe, like if you really just deep down you don't want to believe, of course you can leave this with what Keller says here at the very last. So it's all inconclusive. All you're saying is that on the whole, God probably exists, but nobody can make an airtight case. Yes, we started with that, right? We did that last time. And of course, that means no one can know if there's a God or not. Keller says, I don't agree, and I would agree with Keller. I don't agree with that assessment. Just because we can't do an airtight case, provable case, doesn't mean there's no God. Or that we can't know. In fact, in the next chapter, he says, I don't want to argue why God may exist. I want to demonstrate that you already know that God does exist. This is very interesting. I want to demonstrate that you already know that God does exist. I'd like to convince the reader that whatever you may profess intellectually, belief in God is an unavoidable basic belief that we cannot prove, but can't not know. We know God is there. That is why even when we believe with all our minds that life is meaningless, we simply can't live that way. We know better. And so ultimately, again, we find what Keller is doing here is saying that if you are going to be a secular person, if you are going to reject belief in God, no matter what kind of fancy logic and reasoning you're trying to use, science, whatever, ultimately, it doesn't hold up. The arguments are worse for disproving God and for taking down the case for God than the arguments for God. And you have to live inconsistent with your own conclusions in a way that's far more inconsistent than the hypocrisy of Christians. That's the case he's going to make. I'm excited to take a look at the next chapter. I think my voice is done for tonight. But really a fascinating thing. Probably something most of you haven't spent a whole lot of time thinking about. And maybe some of you skeptics and seekers out there, you've maybe used these arguments before, but you've probably never thought through it the way that Keller has here. Again, there's evidence on all sides. It's not just Christians pointing out the inconsistencies. It's also people within the non-faith community that recognize this now. So anyway, it's been great to be with you. I hope you had some time to enjoy your sweet, delicious, delectable desserts. I know I enjoyed having some ice cream, and I just hope you remember and if you don't already believe in Jesus, you don't already believe in God, uh, that as you're getting through these videos, that you're getting to a place that you're understanding at least why I can say that Jesus is, ice cream is sweet, but Jesus is sweeter. Thanks for tuning in to Sweet Jesus. Hope to catch up with you next week. Take care. God bless. Bye.